Welcome to the Rank and File Educators Emergency Meeting, Stop the Deadly Reopening of the Schools. My name is Jerry White. I'm the labor editor of the World Socialist website. I am pleased to announce that we have scores and scores of participants, educators from around the country and in fact around the world participating this afternoon. We've called this meeting because teachers and students, parents will not allow themselves to be used as human sacrifices in a reckless and in fact homicidal policy to open the schools in the midst of a raging pandemic. We are building a network of opposition to prepare for a nationwide strike of educators and workers to prevent this catastrophe. The purpose of our meeting today is to give educators the scientific facts and the understanding of who our allies are in this fight and who our enemies are. But we are not just talking, we are organizing the opposition of educators, parents, and students. And we urge all of you, when you leave this meeting, to go back into your areas, to organize meetings in your schools and the communities, to set up independent rank and file safety committees, and link together in this network to fight for a national strike. Now, we have several speakers today outlining what is behind the homicidal policy being pursued by politicians of all stripes, what the situation is, and what educators must do to fight. We will have Dr. Benjamin Mateus, who has written extensively on the pandemic and the dangers to workers and educators. We will have speakers, we'll take reports from teachers and educators in different parts of the country and throughout the world. We want to encourage as much participation as possible. After the initial reports, we want to open the floor and have educators give us concise reports of what is happening in your areas, what is being done to resist. What you need to do is to, on the dashboard that you have in front of you, in order to speak, you have to raise your hand, and then we will recognize you and unmute you. You then have to unmute yourself so that we can hear you. And also you can submit questions in the questions panel on the dashboard. So once again, I'd like to welcome everyone here. This is clearly an expression of the huge opposition. We want to encourage everyone to participate. At the same time, we have many people on the call, so we're urging people to speak quite concisely so that everyone has the opportunity to speak. Our first speaker is Evan Blake, a former teacher from Northern California and member of the Socialist Equality Party, who has written extensively on the struggles of educators for the WSWS. Evan, you have the floor.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Good.
Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the first online meeting of the Educators Rank and File Safety Committee. As Jerry said, my name is Evan Blake, and I write for the WSWS on education, and I've been a member of the SEP since 2014. As Jerry said, I used to teach special education in Oakland, California. Before that, I was a substitute teacher and a para-educator in a CESDC. So I wanted to start my report by reviewing some of the latest developments with the drive to reopen schools, as well as the state of the pandemic in the US and globally. Can you go to the next slide, please, Zach? So this map shows the results of the first month of reopening schools, which, as we've written on the WSWS, has already been a complete catastrophe. There have been well over 2,800 reported infections of students and staff from at least 800 schools in 46 states across the country. In Florida, dozens of schools have reported infections with at least 1,200 confirmed cases. In Mississippi, 71 of the state's 82 counties have reported outbreaks of COVID-19 in schools. at least 200 students and 250 teachers have tested positive across Mississippi, while over 2,600 students and staff have been forced into 2-week quarantines. Next slide, please. This slide shows a photo that was taken at North Paulding High School by a 15-year-old student named Hannah, showing packed hallways and students walking around without masks. The student, Hannah, was actually suspended for posting this, but there was a national outcry and the principal was forced to reverse this move. But across Georgia, at least 84 schools have already had outbreaks with a combined 337 confirmed cases. In the Cherokee County School District alone, nearly 2,500 students and 62 staff members have gone into quarantine. In Nevada, run by Democrat Steve Sisolak, already there are at least 132 cases tied to school reopenings. And in response to the public concern over the surge in cases, there are now reports that a growing number of school districts and states are simply no longer reporting outbreaks when they happen. Next slide. Now, since the beginning of July, when the Trump administration began escalating the campaign to reopen schools, there's been a huge outpouring of opposition among teachers, school workers, parents, and students. There have been hundreds of protests in nearly every state. This past week, nearly half of all teachers and support staff in an Arizona school district carried out a wildcat sick-out strike, refusing to return to schools while the pandemic is raging out of control. There are now dozens of Facebook groups across the country in nearly every state that are opposed to school reopenings, many with tens of thousands of members. These have become democratic forums to voice opposition and to organize against these homicidal policies. And a week ago today, we announced the formation of the Educators Rank and File Safety Committee. Our organization is fighting to break through the isolation that's being imposed on educators and to unite across district and state lines. We're fighting to link up with auto workers, Amazon and logistics workers, nurses, and the entire working class to prepare for a nationwide general strike to halt the reopening of schools, stop the spread of the pandemic, and save lives. Next slide, please. In response to the immense growth of opposition, the Trump administration on Tuesday branded teachers and all education workers, quote, critical infrastructure workers, end quote. This determination was made by an agency within the Department of Homeland Security, no doubt with direct coordination with the White House. The DHS is the same agency that oversees the paramilitary BORTAC forces, which Trump deployed in Portland and other cities last month as part of his preparations to erect a presidential dictatorship. Essentially, by branding educators critical infrastructure workers, Trump is enabling state and local officials to invoke national security and use their repressive state apparatus to force teachers and school workers back to work, even if they're known to have come to contact with someone infected with COVID-19. And these photos on this slide show the BORTAC paramilitary forces assaulting protesters in Portland, and then on the right, it's I believe that they're being deployed overseas, which is unusual for DHS forces, but it's a really reactionary paramilitary force within the domestic police apparatus. And a similar process to Trump's branding of the educators as critical infrastructure workers unfolded in April when Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to brand meat packers as essential workers and forced them back into unsafe conditions, which led to thousands of infections and the deaths of at least 65 workers. And yesterday, the CDC updated its guidelines on reopening schools, in which they promote in-person learning and repeat the lies that children are less susceptible to COVID-19 and don't spread the virus as much as adults. And bending to the pressure of the Trump administration, which has declared that science should not stand in the way of reopening schools, the CDC, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and others have advanced unscientific claims to promote Trump's political agenda. The next report by Comrade Benjamin will go into the latest science on COVID-19, which really thoroughly disproves these claims. And the conditions that we face now are life and death, and we have to organize and act quickly and with great determination to put an end to this madness. For our struggle to be successful, we have to base ourselves on an understanding of the objective situation and the tasks that we face. And in order to understand the drive to reopen schools, we have to review the experience of the pandemic more broadly. Next slide, please. So these two charts show the cumulative cases and deaths in 7 of the hardest hit countries around the world. You can see the green line shows the United States. I think it's brown is Brazil and so on. But as of this morning, 23,253,459 people have been infected and 805,697 have died from COVID-19 around the world. In the US, 5,813,607 people have been infected and 179,551 have died. The virus is completely out of control, and testing is being deliberately curtailed and manipulated by authorities, while no robust contact tracing programs exist in the US. Next slide, please. Looking at this map, which shows the current 7-day moving average for each country, we can see the hotspots in the world, with the US leading the way. Brazil and Colombia, and really all of Latin America, are being devastated by the virus, as are India, Russia, South Africa, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the Middle East. And cases are once again on the rise throughout Europe. So how did we get to this point? Fundamentally, the pandemic is a social and political crisis, not solely a medical one. The technology exists to contain and eradicate the virus, but the social system in which we live makes this impossible. The fact that everything is subordinated to private profit and the world is divided into rival nation states prevents the rational implementation of basic public health measures worldwide, including mass testing, robust contact tracing, and providing universal high-quality healthcare. After the initial outbreak in Wuhan, China, the ruling elites across Europe, Australia, the Americas, and throughout Asia and Africa downplayed the seriousness of the pandemic and did the bare minimum to contain the virus. This was epitomized by the most fascistic world leaders, led by Trump, and including Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Boris Johnson in Britain, and many others who openly pursued a policy of developing quote-unquote herd immunity based on mass infections and deaths. Similar policies were pursued everywhere, and it was just revealed this week that the leading epidemiologist in Sweden actively kept schools open in the spring in order to spread the virus throughout the population. Sweden now has roughly 10 times the number of deaths of its neighbor, Finland. Next slide, please. Now, the shutdown of production, which took place throughout March, only happened when workers internationally took matters into their own hands. Auto workers across Europe and North America carried out wildcat strikes in open defiance of management and the unions, including the United Auto Workers in the US, which is embroiled in a multi-million-dollar bribery scandal. Teachers around the world increasingly demanded that schools shut down, forcing the hand of local authorities that had deliberately kept them open. And recent scientific studies have proven that these lockdowns saved millions of lives worldwide. Next slide. With the stock markets plummeting, the ruling classes globally moved quickly to carry out the largest bailouts in history, far surpassing the then historic bailouts of 2008. In the US, the CARES Act passed on a near unanimous bipartisan basis, including the votes of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Roughly $3 trillion was injected into the markets by the Federal Reserve, which for the first time began purchasing corporate debt. The Fed's balance sheet has now ballooned to over $7 trillion. We can see on this graph the rapid upswing of the Dow after March 27, when the CARES Act was passed. America's billionaires have fully recouped their losses, while nearly 30 million people have filed for unemployment. At the end of July, federal benefits were cut off as Congress went on vacation, threatening millions with eviction and homelessness. Immediately after passing the CARES Act, the Democrats and Republicans at every level initiated the Return to Work campaign to force workers back into unsafe conditions in order to extract profits to back up the mountain of debt they'd created. As a result, infections skyrocketed once again, and over 50,000 people died from COVID-19 in the US in June and July alone. Next slide, please. It's within this context that the drive to reopen schools is unfolding. The ruling class must resume production and the pumping out of profits, and in order to do that, they have to force children back into schools to be able to force parents back to work. If teachers, students, and parents die from the virus, especially those with pre-existing health conditions, the ruling elite sees this as a positive good that will help them slash spending on healthcare. While Trump and the Republicans are most brutally conducting this campaign, the Democrats are equally beholden to Wall Street and are pushing for the full reopening of schools. Throughout the pandemic, they have issued empty phrases about safety while fully supporting and implementing the Back to Work campaign and now the Back to School campaign. Next slide, please. With the Democratic National Convention taking place this past week, the party selected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as its candidates, who represent the most right-wing sections of the party. Biden has a 50-year career implementing austerity, while Harris was the top cop in California and implemented policies to jail parents if their children became truant. Alongside Obama, Biden oversaw the mass privatization of schools and the laying off of hundreds of thousands of teachers. One of his campaign advisors has already said that he'll implement austerity if elected. They have no plan to respond to the pandemic, which requires a massive mobilization of resources and the reversal of the handouts to Wall Street. At the state level, New York Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo has sanctioned the reopening of schools across the state, including in New York City, the largest school district in the country. Schools are also opening up in Michigan, led by Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, largely to force auto workers back into the plants, which have reported high rates of absenteeism among parents. Significant outbreaks of COVID-19 have already happened in multiple Democrat-led states, where at least some districts have fully reopened in the summer and fall, including Illinois, Michigan, Hawaii, California, and others. And the chief allies of the Democratic Party in reopening schools are the teacher unions, including the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, and their state and local affiliates. AFT President Randy Weingarten, shown here with Biden, sits on the DNC and has an annual salary above $500,000, placing her in the top 1% of income earners. The unions are working to isolate educators by state and district, dissipate anger through temporary delays and legal maneuvers, promote the unsafe hybrid model, and other tactics to buy time for the full reopening of the schools. Above all, they are doing everything they can to prevent a nationwide strike increasingly being demanded by educators, because this would lead to a direct confrontation, not only with Trump, but Biden and the Democratic Party. The central question facing teachers, education workers, parents, and students is the need to build new forms of organization to coordinate a unified response to the nationwide campaign to reopen schools. It is for this reason that the Educators Rank and File Safety Committee was founded, in order to unite the immense opposition to the homicidal policies of the ruling class. This national body is serving as a central organization to coordinate the building of a network of independent rank and file committees in every school and neighborhood. The committees will fight to link up with broader sections of the working class, facing the same deadly working conditions. We are preparing for a nationwide general strike to halt the reopening of schools and the broader return to work campaign. Next slide, please. Our committee has issued these demands, which we urge all educators, parents, and students to adopt and fight for in your schools and neighborhoods. This is what we're fighting for and what has to be done. Number one, for the immediate closure of all public, private, and charter schools. It is impossible to safely open schools during a raging pandemic. The loss of life and the permanent physical and emotional damage to children who spread the disease to teachers, parents, and grandparents dwarfs any disruption caused by online learning. Number two, full funding for public education, internet access, and online instruction. The trillions handed over to the rich must be redistributed to provide universal access to high-speed internet, food security, mental health care, special education supports, and all other resources needed to provide the best quality remote learning for every student and educator. Number 3, full income protection to all parents and caregivers who stay home with their children. We are not oblivious to the needs of parents. The money handed over to the rich must be used to provide full income to those who cannot work because they must stay home with their children. Full unemployment benefits must be restored and funding increased to protect families, and a permanent moratorium put in place to stop all evictions and home foreclosures. Number 4, no loss of income for educators who choose to stay home. Teachers and education workers who refuse to work in unsafe conditions must be provided with full income and benefits for the duration of the pandemic, not fined and penalized. Number 5, for free speech and the protection of whistleblowers. All those who speak out against unsafe conditions, whether in schools, factories, warehouses, hospitals, or offices, must be defended against any victimization by employers or state officials. And number 6, halt all non-essential production. Until the pandemic is contained, only key industries such as food production, medical care, and logistics should remain open. Workers in those industries must be provided with the most advanced safety measures to prevent infection. All non-essential workers and laid-off workers must be provided with full unemployment benefits and access to free healthcare. We argue that the fight against the pandemic cannot be subordinated to the needs of the ruling class. Wall Street should be the last concern on anyone's minds. What has to guide our response are the needs of society and the interests of workers, educators, and students. So far, everything's been done in the interests of the corporations, but a new stage in the class struggle is opening up, and to fight for its interests and for public health, the working class has to be organized. Everything depends on the independent initiative of educators, parents, students, and the entire working class. We urge you to get involved with this work, to share our statement and coverage widely, build rank and file safety committees at your schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods, and consciously prepare for the necessary struggles that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evan. One of the means in which the justification for the reopening of the schools has been carried out is the completely unscientific claims that COVID-19 does not affect children, that children are not potential spreaders. So our next speaker, Dr. Benjamin Mateus, is here to respond to these claims and to explain the science behind COVID-19 and what must be done to protect the lives of educators, parents, and students. So, Dr. Benjamin, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. This is Dr. Benjamin Mateus, and thank you for letting me speak. The science of the pandemic and its relationship with the fight of the teachers for a safe school and safe environment for their children, I think, needs to be clarified. There's a lot of misconceptions. I think one of the fundamental issues that we need to discuss is what the definition of herd immunity is. Zach, can you go to the next slide, please? Herd immunity is a term that's been used probably incorrectly, but its main function is to address the issue of vaccines and how many people you need to vaccinate to establish a population that develops sufficient immunity that people who aren't vaccinated can forego the vaccination, presumably, and not get the disease. But its application in the present pandemic is essentially criminal. Explicit or implicit, it is the operating policy of the ruling classes that place the interest of profit above that of lives. We have the technology, we understand the science of pandemics, and we possess vast economic resources to essentially contain and eradicate this virus. So any talk of herd immunity is utterly bankrupt. Next slide, please. I think Mike Ryan said it best even at the recent World Health Organization press brief. He said, I think that we can say with certainty right now as a planet, as a global population, We are nowhere close to the levels of immunity required to stop this disease transmitting, and we need to focus on what we can actually do now to suppress transmission and not live in the hope of herd immunity being our salvation. Right now, that is not a solution. Next slide, please. Herd immunity, which is the idea that the virus cannot spread widely when there are not enough susceptible people, is achieved when a significant percent of the population, the range has been suggested as low as 50% and as high as 80%, have antibodies either through infection or vaccination. Studies estimate that less than 10% of the population has evidence of antibodies against the virus, although some places, such as New York City, may be up to 20%. And that means, according to Maria Van Kerkhove, that means that a large proportion of the population remains susceptible. And studies are underway to document the immune response to the virus to see how strong it is and how long it lasts. We don't have a complete picture of this yet. And it's clear that potentially that the immunity to COVID-19 may actually wane after 3 to 6 months. That is true of some of the other coronaviruses as well. Next slide, please. However, and we're going to jump into Sweden briefly because it has been used as a model for herd immunity. We recently published in on the World Socialist website an email that was exchanged through Freedom of Information Act that it shows the criminality of these measures. The Swedish chief epidemiologist, his name is Anders Tegnell, said in March, one point might speak for keeping schools open, is in order to reach herd immunity more quickly. The Finnish authority who was emailing him turned around and said that's true, but probably the Finnish authority said he rejected that idea of attempting to use children to spread the virus. But Tegnell, trying to defend himself, said true, but probably mostly to each other because of the extremely age-stratified contact structure we have, which is false because young people will spread it to older people. Additionally, Johan Giesecke, who served as a state epidemiologist from 1995 to 2005, also wrote to a Swedish insurance company explaining to them he believes that the virus is going to sweep like a storm over Sweden and infect basically everyone in 1 or 2 months, trying to make the case that herd immunity is going to happen whether they like it or not. And he complained to his to his youngerling that I think we should relax the closures of upper secondary schools and universities after Easter. They play no epidemiological role, and it would be a signal change for the better. And ultimately, that policy was implemented. So let's go looking at what this policy meant by looking at the graphs. Next slide, please. So this is a slide of case fatality rates, and I compared it to various countries that were in the vicinity of Sweden or share similar Swedish cultures or Nordic cultures. And as we can see, Sweden stood alone compared to other countries with this case fatality rate exceeding those other nations by a factor of 3 at a minimum. Next slide, please. This is daily new confirmed cases, and as we see, everybody had a similar surge in new cases, and then the lockdown measures happened. But Sweden followed their own lax distancing measures, and essentially what we see again is a multiple-fold higher level than their border countries, and the peak here happened as they resumed schools again. Next slide, please. And this one shows the number of deaths per million people. And again, here on the order of almost 5-fold higher than their comparative in Denmark, Finland, and Norway. Next slide, please. And this is also very important, is that Sweden's lax policy has led to a per capita death rate that's higher than even the United States. So that is the policy of herd immunity in a nutshell. Next slide, please. The Stat News wrote, and I think it was an interesting comment, and I think it's worth remarking on. The Swedish approach was to largely allow businesses to remain open And at first it seemed to work with a death count nowhere near what it was in countries such as Italy, Spain, and the UK. But even as Sweden was being hailed as a model, its cases were steadily rising, and its death rate now exceeds that of the US. Sweden also did not seem to stave off the economic damage it was aiming to avoid. I couldn't have said it better myself. Next slide, please. So these are the lies that the ruling classes are purporting. Children are less susceptible to infection and don't develop serious symptoms from COVID-19. Children rarely transmit COVID-19, and schools can be reopened safely. And I think there is now a body of evidence that is coming out that refutes every one of these. Next slide, please. Recently, I think at the end of the month, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, was speaking on a video conference with the American Federation of Teachers with President Randy Weingarten present, and he said essentially, and this created a firestorm. In many respects, unfortunately, though, this may sound a little scary and harsh. I don't mean it to be that way. Is that you're going to be actually part of an experiment of the learning curve. What we need to know, because remember, early on when we shut down the country, as it were, the schools were shut down. So we don't know the full impact. We don't have the total database of knowing what there is to expect. This certainly put Fauci incorrectly in a bad light. He's more of a politician than a scientist. And as a scientist, he should clearly say we don't do experiments on teachers and on children. We don't do experiments without consent. And in fact, we already have enough information to know that this is a deadly venture, and such an experiment is tantamount to a crime against humanity. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 available data for children. It's interesting and surprising and alarming that the ability to get data on children is so difficult. The state is in complete disarray, and trying to get this information is very difficult. Only 9 states provide age distribution of testing. 21 states in New York City provide age distribution just for hospitalizations, and 45 states in New York City provide age distribution for deaths. Definition of children does vary a little bit, and this impacts the accuracy of the data. However, next slide, please. So this graph was created out of the American Academy of American Pediatric Pediatricians. They do publish weekly updates, and so they have a table that we were able to access, and we created this graph. And what this clearly shows is that over the weeks to August, children have been becoming a larger part of the total cumulative COVID-19 infection. And this rise shows that children do get infected, and as we will show later, they are certainly a vector for additional infections in the community. Next slide, please. This is an important slide as well. There's an entity called positivity rate, or percent positive test. And that basically means that if you, let's say, do 100 tests and 20 are positive, that would make your rate of tests 20%. The World Health Organization has said that any place that opens should be under 5%. That means if you did 100 tests, only 5 should be positive. It's a measure of how robust your testing is and how effectively you're testing. The United States is at around 6 to 7%, as shown by the black line. But what I enjoyed about this, what I thought this graph showed very well, was that the percent positivity by age group, in all actuality, those who are 0 to 4 years of age or 5 to 17 actually have the highest positivity rate. So what it implies is that children are not being tested to the same level as adults. And this would imply that children have a higher rate of infection that is unknown right now. Next slide, please. So there's an association. So there's a study that came out in JAMA just this month, looking at the association between statewide school closures and COVID-19 incidents. And hopefully we'll make these slides available to everyone. But when COVID-19 incidents in the state at the time of school closures ranged from 0 to 14.75 cases per 100,000, what they found was that school closures were associated with a decline in the incidence of COVID-19 by 62%. So that's a tremendous number. And what they found was that over 26 days, the school closures had not occurred. They projected that the number of cases would have risen from 214 to 638 cases per 100,000, an almost threefold increase. In other words, the 5 million that we have now would have been in excess of probably 10 to 15 million had we not closed schools. Now, the absolute effect associated with school closures during the 16-day period after school closure on mortality, at the time, it was 3.2 per 100,000, and it only went to 6.8 deaths instead of 19.4 deaths. And what they projected was that the number of deaths would have increased from 22,000 to 64,000. In absolute or in concrete terms, on April 21, instead of having 46,000 deaths, there would have been 88,000 deaths. And so this is very critical to show that just by closing schools, we were able to save 42,000 lives and threefold times the infection rate had we not closed schools. So for anyone that has any questions on did school closures help prevent infections, I think this one is important to keep on your in your pocket in defense of school closures. Next one, please. There have been multiple studies that have been done. This is just one other one in Nature that came out a while back. And basically they said that in the absence of any policy action, we estimated that early infections of COVID-19 would exhibit an exponential growth rate of approximately 38% per day. That's why the graphs look the way they do. They begin to climb very rapidly because the number of people who are infected go on to infect others. The number of cases begin to rise exponentially, and so in the early days, the graphs look very flat, but they're actually climbing very quickly. It's just the numbers are small. And what they did was that they projected that among these 6 countries, and that's the United States, South Korea, China, Italy, Iran, and France, they were able to, through their lockdowns, prevent on the order of 61 million confirmed cases. We're presently at, I think, 22 or 23 million. And so that's a significant decrease in number of infections and deaths. Next, please. The purpose of this graph was mainly to show is that for those countries that rapidly moved to lockdown, like China, South Korea, and to some extent Iran, the difference between the projected rates and where they actually were was highest. The United States and to some extent France delayed closure and their activity, and their lockdown measures were not as strict. And that's why the curve on the bottom one, the United States, is slightly less down to the bottom, so to speak. So the difference between the projected and the blue is not as high. But nonetheless, these measures did have a significant impact. There were, on the curve to the right, or the chart to the right, there were 4.8 million fewer estimated cases projected due to the lockdowns. Next slide, please. Now, this was a smaller study that recently came out, and I think it was a critical study because it did catch the media attention. But until this one came out, the direct relationship between children and infections were not clear. So there was an overnight camp in Georgia that was open in June, and during June 21 through 27, that was a period of the camp. On the 23rd of June, a teenage staff had to leave, and she had developed chills and was tested positive for COVID-19. So they began to send campers home on the 24th, and the camp was closed on the 27th. The Georgia Department of Public Health initiated an investigation, and there were a total of 597 Georgia residents who had attended the camp, and the median age was 12. They had results for 344 people, of which 260 were positive. And that essentially means the attack rate was 44%. 51% were among those who were aged 6 to 10, and 44% among those who were 11 to 17. So the youngest had the highest attack rate, which surprised many. Next slide, please. And certainly, as we know, the attack rate increased with increase in length of time. Those who were in cabins had a 50% attack rate, and 100 reported symptoms. But the study notes that these numbers are underestimates, and they couldn't assess individual adherence to COVID-19 prevention measures. Basically, what they were surprised by was that the younger aged children were actually infected, and a significant number of people were infected, which then brought to attention the inevitable knowledge that children can become infected and pass the infection to others. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Dr. Benjamin, can I interject for a minute?
Sure.
Of course, you've got an intense amount of data. I just wanted to let everyone on the call know that when there's questions and answers, we can certainly go back to particular slides, and we will also do everything to make these slides available. Go ahead, Benjamin.
I will try to keep my comments down to 5 more minutes, and we'll get to the main one. So this particular study from Italy was a contact tracing study, and essentially what they found was the attack rate was about 13.3%, or 890 people of 6,700 contacts developed COVID-19. But what they found was that among 14 cases that were age 0 to 14, 11 of their 49 contacts became cases, for an attack rate of 22.4%, which was the highest rate of any age. Go to the next slide, please. Next slide. So the greater risk of spread resulting from contact with an infected child that emerged from our analysis, they write, might be explained by the different nature of interactions between adults and children. While the positive adult would be likely to be more adherent with isolation precautions, it may be more difficult to truly isolate children, resulting in continuing contact with parents and siblings. Overall, they write, our data are therefore in support of a policy of maximum caution with respect to the reopening of children's communities and primary schools. And they also did an analysis of viral load. They found that the children carry a similar viral load as adults, confirming that children can also transmit the virus. This was a very critical study in showing that children were involved in the passing of the virus to adults, and these studies sort of established the ability for children to not only become infected, but to pass the infection. Next slide, please. Similarly, the South Korea study showed that young people had caused the highest attack rate in the household. And certainly communities are different, Italian communities versus South Korean communities, but there's a similar pattern here. Next slide, please. The comments by Michael Osterholm, an infectious disease expert at the University of Minnesota, is critical. I fear, he says, that there has been this sense that kids just won't get infected or don't get infected in the same way as adults, and that therefore they're almost like a bubbled population. There will be transmission. What we have to do is accept that now and include that in our plan. Next slide, please. This was a Chicago study that also caught a lot of attention. They looked at children who were under 5 to 17 and 18, and they did viral load testing through swabs in their nose. Next slide, please. what was critical here is that they observed that young children and adults the difference between young children and adults resulted in about a 10 to 100-fold greater amount of virus in the upper respiratory tract of young children. This was an actual surprise to the scientists and the doctors who were evaluating, caring for these kids. They did not expect this. Next slide, please. Shifting quickly just to schools, I found this to be an interesting scientific evaluation of how much virus is contained in a cough, a sneeze, or breath. A cough can release 3,000 droplets that can travel at 50 miles per hour. A sneeze can send that up to 200 miles per hour with up to 30,000 droplets. And if someone is infected, they can release 200,000 virus particles in their sneeze into the environment. These have to be, understood when someone is around in a closed environment, they cough or sneeze. This is the physics of how we interact with each other in that environment. Next slide, please. Which leads to the issue of this idea called airborne transmission of COVID-19. This is critical in that prior to these studies coming out, many of the scientists would say it's important to stay 6 feet apart, wash your hands, and maintain respiratory hygiene, which are very critical. But there's more evidence that suggests that perhaps these, what they call super spreaders and or transmission is really happening through aerosolization of this virus particle. And this realization was critical and to advance how we need to behave with this pandemic. That's why the mask studies came out that suggest that there are some benefits, but the aerosolization of the virus is critical to the spreading of this infection. And it's this aerosolization that makes this opening of schools very dangerous. This community of physicists and scientists appealed to the World Health Organization to consider writing in their directive that this virus can be aerosolized as microdroplets, and it will be critical to control this route of transmission. Next slide, please. So studies by the signatories and other scientists have demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that viruses are released during exhalation, talking, and coughing in microdroplets, small enough to remain aloft in air and pose a risk of exposure at distance beyond 1 to 2 meters from an infected individual. They've known this with SARS-CoV-1, and retrospective analysis has shown the same for SARS-CoV-2. Next slide, please. This is this study came out a little more than 2 weeks ago from Florida that one of the questions were that, yes, perhaps there are aerosolization, but how do we know if these viruses are viable? And these scientists came up with a very interesting way of collecting specimens. And what they showed is that they were able to, there was viable virus isolated from air samples collected 2 meters to 4.8 meters, which is 16 feet away from patients. And I think this study, as many have said, clinched the necessary structure of how it happens, or can it happen, that aerosolization does occur. It does mean that the distances of 6 feet may not be safe anymore. And the aerosolization of the virus is definitely no longer a theoretical construct. Next slide, please. We're coming to the end of this. I just wanted to briefly talk on school ventilation for COVID-19. The American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers has stated that essentially the transmission of SARS-CoV-2 through the air is sufficiently likely that airborne exposure to the virus should be controlled. Changes to building operations, including the operation of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, can reduce airborne exposure. there's strong evidence that improper ventilation can lead to the spreading of diseases. Next slide, please. Zach, can you go to the slide that says how many teachers are at risk of serious illness if infected with coronavirus? It's slide 36. Just to conclude, it's important to know that students are not in isolation. Children are not in isolation. They are part of the community. They come and go to school. Their parents bring them to school. They interact with their teachers, and teachers are people. And they interact with the parents. And it's critical to understand that when the CDC guidelines just speaks about low risks for children, given the infectivity of children, teachers are a critical component of this whole equation. So the Center for Disease has identified a number of factors that put individuals at increased risk, and we know these. People with lung disease, people with diabetes, people with heart disease, people with asthma are at increased risk. Being older puts you at increased risk. Next slide, please. So there are nearly 1.5 million teachers that are at greater risk of serious illness infected with coronavirus. That means 1 in 4. That's a massive number of teachers. If we add the number of intergenerational families that live amongst people who are older than 65, who are in a home, millions of them have school-age children being come home every afternoon after school that place their parents and their grandparents at risk. Next slide, please. If you can go to the new CDC guidelines, Zach. Slide 40. Next one. So it's important just to conclude, there are over 30 states that have a positivity rate of over the lax 5% set by the WHO. And testing in the US is on the decline, and it needs to be tenfold higher than it is. Contact tracing and public health initiatives are lacking. This makes the return to school utterly negligent on the part of those who are driving teachers to return to the classroom. There isn't the infrastructure needed to identify where the virus is and be able to stop it. Next slide, please. It's not. So we have established that the WWS and rank and file committee recommend putting positivity rates nationally at less than 0.1%. This is very doable. We have the means to eradicate this virus. It takes a huge initiative, but it's a national, international initiative. Schools can be retrofitted. We have the means to build up the contact tracing and testing necessary. We have the ability to meet all the needs of society to contain this virus. And with positivity rate that is 0.1%, this is very much doable. This is far below or far more strict than the World Health Organization, but I think it clearly shows where we need to be to make the community and schools safe for everyone. I will, again, I'm sorry for speaking at length, but I think this was very critical to acknowledge that the science of the COVID-19 and the pandemic speaks directly to the needs of the teachers to shut schools down and save children and the community.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin, for clearly a very comprehensive report. We will have time during questions and answers to raise specific questions. There have been in the question panel a number of questions related to the science and medicine. Of course, Dr. Mateus has made it clear that teachers have science on their side, while the White House has said science will not get in the way. And the Democratic Party and the unions have said, falsely claimed, that schools can be safely reopened in the midst of a pandemic. Our next speaker is Renee Casimides. She is a Southern California teacher. She will speak to the conditions that teachers have confronted as the schools have opened, and also take up the completely hypocritical claims by all stripes of politicians that their sole concern in pushing for the reopening of the schools is the needs of children. So Renee, you have the floor.
Thanks, Jerry. So yeah, my name's Renee Casimeda. I'm, I'll try to be brief. Again, I'm a teacher in Southern California, and a member of the newly established the Educators Rank and File Safety Committee. And I want to give greetings to everyone on the call today, and repeat and in fact emphasize a few major points in our perspective. Firstly, we insist that there is no such thing as a safe reopening to in-person instruction under the current conditions as have been outlined and detailed by Evan and Dr. Mateus in their reports. And in fact, a dangerous and deadly catastrophe is unfolding in the schools throughout the country, and in fact, internationally. Just to point out a few experiences from those who have returned to the classrooms. Parents have been required to sign waivers releasing liability in the event their child contracts the virus and dies. And students afraid, left in the dark when it comes to cases at their own school sites. They face daily risks to their lives, and the looming trauma of being a carrier through which they will be faced with sickness and death of their friends, their family members, and even their teachers. And educators have been told by district officials that they need to have their wills in order. Teachers face double, if not triple, workloads. They have had to cobble together makeshift barriers in their overcrowded classrooms to attempt to impose some sense of protection from the virus given the lack of PPE. And if Zach, you can go to the slide of the two photos I have here. Yeah, so I wanted to point to these photos, of which there are countless iterations of this on social media, showcasing the dire situation teachers are currently faced with, and that students are being thrown into. This photo here on the left from a teacher who, first of all, has already contracted the virus once, which in fact caused heart damage. She's at high risk. She's being thrown back into the classroom, and in fact is compelled to construct a makeshift wall of shower curtains by herself with her own materials to try to keep herself safe. This photo really sums up the state of things, along with the photo on the right of extreme lack of PPE for the entire year given to teachers, and this is seen throughout the United States. And I want to make the point, we saw the same conditions when frontline nurses and healthcare workers were forced to wear trash bags due to lack of PPE in the early months of the spread of the virus in major epicenter cities like New York City, among others. So, we're seeing teachers in schools also, being fired at will for speaking out against these deadly policies. Others are resigning by the dozens in their school districts, even though they face major fines and risk losing their teaching credentials due to a breach of contract. So there are disastrous conditions taking place, and this is not even to mention the explosion of cases in the schools in recent weeks. And I want to reiterate the point, Evan had mentioned this, that throwing children and youth back into dangerous classrooms, it has to happen in order to force workers back into unsafe workplaces to produce the profits that are necessary to pay off the extremely massive bailout of Wall Street that happened in recent months. This is the impetus behind the consciously murderous bipartisan campaign supported by the unions to reopen the schools to in-person instruction. It's the linchpin to fully reopening the economy, and is therefore, one of the top priorities of the ruling class. And this is happening in both Republican and democratically run states. Here in California, many districts have started the school year fully online, largely, I would say, and I want to argue, due to the fury of opposition from parents and teachers and school workers to reopen in person. Yet, Governor Newsom in California is approving preschool and elementary schools to reopen face-to-face throughout the state as we speak. He supports plans in, one of the largest school districts in the US, in Los Angeles, to reopen face-to-face as soon as possible under a completely limited testing program that has been announced to essentially give the veneer of safety. And the online start for many school districts throughout the state is merely biding time to implement a speedy reopening. We're seeing this not only in California, but other Democratic Party-run states such as New York and Hawaii. Both parties have cynically claimed that they're motivated by the academic and emotional needs of children. This is a complete insult to the lived experience of students and teachers in the schools which have reopened. And they can tell you firsthand, I'm sure there are many of you on the call right now, that the academic and emotional needs of children are not being met. It's an insult to teachers who've been fighting for their students, engaging in wildcat strikes across the US since 2018 to fight to put an end to the grossly overcrowded schools, underfunded classrooms, wrought by the efforts of both Democrats and Republicans alike. And really, despite the hollow considerations for students, what's actually taking place is that the ruling class is making every effort to not let a crisis go to waste. In response to the pandemic, we actually are witnessing an escalation of the looting of public education amidst massive economic devastation to public institutions, and in fact toward privatization, which is seen in a multitude of ways. For example, the school closures and elimination of hundreds of thousands of jobs since the month of March for educators and school workers, the outsourcing of virtual learning companies in almost every school district, and plans to turn those into online charters within the public school apparatus. It's seen in Secretary DeVos's move to provide CARES Act funding for religious and private schools, pushing the line of school choice. And we can point to countless other instances amid the crisis. The economic impacts of the pandemic have deepened the chasm between the rich and poor in the country. Inequality is facing devastating levels, as has been outlined, and we see this currently exacerbated in the schools. It's estimated that US public schools face a cumulative debt of more than $300 billion in the coming years as a result of the pandemic. And we argue this will be used by both Democrats and Republicans alike to push further austerity. And I want to make the point that we absolutely reject this. Zach, if you can go to the next slide. This is just a chart of the overwhelming wealth of the top 5 US billionaires. And it also outlines the growth of their wealth amid the pandemic in just March through June. And really what this shows is that the financial elite is celebrating a bonanza. As they're pushing workers back to work, they're throwing open the schools, but the combined wealth of 3.5 trillion. The top 5 US billionaires, can more than cover the debt, and in fact can fund what is necessary for high quality public education even amid a raging pandemic. We reject the lie that there's no money, not when trillions of dollars can be printed out of thin air, handed to Wall Street, while teachers and students are placed in mortal danger. And we insist, as is laid out in our demands, that the resources do exist that can guarantee, amid the pandemic, state-of-the-art remote learning, full-speed internet for all, where special education needs are met, nutrition needs are met, etc. And just finally, there are dangerous conditions facing teachers across the country, and are by every measure identical from state to state. We can't remain isolated by our districts, by the trade unions, and we're fighting for a political program that puts the health and safety of every student and teacher as the fundamental priority over the profits of the capitalist system. And I really want to stress and appeal, the time is now for us to take matters into our own hands, to unite and build our own independent political leadership. That's the basis of, this call, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. I do look forward to hearing from others throughout the discussion. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Renee. Our next speaker is Genevieve Lay. She is the National Secretary of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. She's going to speak on the conditions of working class youth in the public schools and university students who are also being herded back into the schools. We know that the teachers' strikes of 2018-19, as Renee indicated, to defend the rights not only of the teachers and their living standards, but of the youth, enjoyed tremendous support from young people. And the fight against the school openings, a critical component of this is the unity of teachers, all school employees, parents, and young people. So Genevieve, if you have the floor now.
Hi, thanks, Jerry. I want to first just thank all the previous speakers. I'm really encouraged to see so many people on the call today. I'm really eager to hear from everyone, so I'll keep my comments brief so that we can open up the floor. But first, as Jerry said, I want to bring greetings from the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the IYSSE. We're the youth and student wing of the Socialist Equality Party. And my name is Genevieve Lee. I'm the National Secretary of the IYSSE in the US. First, just on behalf of the IYSSEs throughout the country and internationally, I want to bring our utmost support to teachers, staff, parents, and other educators in the struggle to oppose the reopening of schools. The IYSSE is fighting at every level, from grade schools to college campuses, to unite students and teachers in a common struggle for safe, high-quality public education. As we've heard already from Benjamin, the science is very clear. The reopening of schools while the pandemic is raging out of control will lead to countless more needless deaths among students, parents, teachers, and other school workers. In countries where schools have already been open, the consequences have been dire, and really that goes for this country as well. Evan referred to the situation in Georgia, at Georgia high schools just earlier this month, which shows the complete futility of these limited social distancing measures that the districts have used to justify the reopening. Students at North Paulding High School defied the school administration's ban on photos and social media. They leaked photos of packed hallways of unmasked kids in the first few days of classes. And then what happened? There were dozens of new cases, which were quickly confirmed at the high school and in surrounding schools, which proved that the situation in Georgia was not the exception, but instead the rule. A similar situation is unfolding on college campuses. Dozens of schools that had planned for in-person learnings, like UNC Chapel Hill, Notre Dame, they've all been forced to revert to online learning after reopening within the first week, after hundreds of students were confirmed with the virus. Despite all of this evidence, there are still hundreds of schools that are moving forward with reopening in person. In Arizona, 3 major universities are beginning face-to-face instruction this coming week. They're filling up residential halls, despite the fact that the state is considered a hotspot for the virus internationally. In those cases, there's only some of the schools are testing for COVID prior to their arrival on campus. Others are not getting tested until after they've arrived, meaning that they'll be traveling, in some cases from all over the country, to the school, possibly contracting the virus and possibly spreading the virus. I think there was a development earlier this week that I thought really summed up the situation. It's sort of incredible to even consider that something like this could be said. But there was an administrator and professor at Yale University, and this professor sent a very chilling and honest email to the campus residents this week. They said that the students had to be prepared that they could die from COVID while attending school this semester. I'm just going to quote from the email. This professor said, we all should be emotionally prepared for widespread infections and possibly deaths in our community. You should emotionally prepare for the fact that your residential college life will look more like a hospital unit than a residential college. That's the situation facing teachers, young people, staff in 2020 in the most advanced capitalist country in the world. In response to the outbreaks of the virus on campuses, colleges, universities, the administrations have begun blaming the students, and in some cases, they've even used the virus as an excuse to beef up campus police. Boston College, for example, is hiring a Boston police detail to keep an eye on students and break up parties throughout the weekend. The University of Notre Dame similarly has implied that student behavior has been the main factor in the spread of the virus, stating that an increase in cases at his university was, quote, a reminder that the coronavirus plan will only work with total cooperation from the students. This scapegoating of youth for the rise in cases is a complete lie. It's founded on a lie. The spread of COVID is not the fault of a relatively small number of students, but as other speakers have said, this is a direct consequence of the criminal response of the American ruling class to the pandemic, which has been entirely oriented to the whims of the financial and corporate elite, which I think the previous speaker outlined very well. The sole reason that the Democrats and Republicans want to herd children back into the schools is so that their parents can return to work and restart the flow of corporate profits, which is needed to finance this massive bailout of Wall Street and the corporations. For this return to work campaign to be accomplished, the virus has to be normalized, along with all of the death that will come with it. And the cost of this decision is playing out in real time. It will result in more cases, more hospitalizations, and more death. Now, this is not what any of the politicians, of course, say to the cameras or the media. Democrats and Republicans alike claim that they're solely motivated by the concerns of the academic and emotional needs of children. These politicians and trade union bureaucrats have the audacity to try to use the students as pawns against the teachers in their homicidal campaign to reopen the economy. They say, in many cases, that teachers are actually harming the students by not opening the schools. They try and blackmail the teachers into going back to the schools in the name of the safety of the students. Well, the supposed concern for the well-being of children never stopped any of these politicians from both of the corporate-backed parties, Democrats and Republicans alike, from spending decades slashing funding from public education, from closing schools, and from gutting vital social services. Furthermore, not one of them dares speak about the permanent psychological damage that will be inflicted on children who lose a teacher, a parent, or a grandparent to the virus, or how they will be affected socially and emotionally when they're told day after day that socializing, hugging, playing on playgrounds, or in other words, being a child, is against the rules. No one says anything about what it will mean for the emotional state of these children if they come to learn that they really have turned into vectors for the virus and have infected loved ones all around them. The fact of the matter is that teachers, counselors, school nurses, and staff, these are the ones that are truly concerned for the safety and well-being of students. The SCP and the IYSSC firmly believe that every effort must be made to unite students and teachers in this campaign. And the IYSSC will be fighting for exactly this. If you're a student listening to this call, we urge you to reject the efforts of the ruling class to use you as a pawn in their campaign, but instead to take a stand on the side of teachers, of health, of progress. There's no doubt that young people are eager and willing to fight. We've seen their courage already in the early days of reopening. Those young high school students in Georgia who defied the school administration rules, exposing their conditions, being suspended for it. We saw the courage of young people just earlier this year in the mass multiracial, multi-ethnic protests that erupted against police brutality, not just in the US, but around the world. And I have no doubt that this is just the beginning. In the next 6 months, the working class will have its say, and the youth will be with them. So I encourage all of those students listening in today to get in touch with us. You can email the IYSSE at iysse@wsws.org. We'll put it in the chat. You can find out more about our youth and student group at iysse.com. If you're a teacher or a parent or other worker, help build this committee. Share our articles and our statements. Get the word out. Use the WSWS as your voice. Now is the time to fight. There is no time to lose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. And I'd like to thank all of the speakers who have started this meeting today. Before we open the floor for questions and comments and reports from different parts of the country and in fact the world, I'd like, if I can, to just try to sum up what we've established and what we are urging teachers and educators and students to do. Perhaps, Zach, if you could put up the slide with the basic questions. First of all, we're urging all of those who are on this call today to join the Educators Rank and File Safety Committee. This shows you how to do it. You can go to wsws.org/educators. You should join and spread the Facebook page. And we want to urge every one of you to go back to your communities, online use of social media, connect with teachers, educators, school employees, parents in your area, and fight for the building of rank and file committees. That is, committees that are completely independent from the influence and the pressure of the corporate interests of the Democrats and Republicans, and also of the trade unions. Everything, as these speakers have indicated, depends on what the working class does. There is enormous opposition. There are hundreds of Facebook pages that have emerged to oppose the reckless return to school. There are meetings, there are protests being organized. That movement has to be united and organized. There is enormous support for educators among the widest section of workers. And we urge you again to go back to your areas to organize rank and file committees. We will give you all the assistance we can in doing that. We will do everything we can to then draw together these rank and file committees from throughout the country into a national network to fight for a general strike against the reopening of the schools. I'd like to propose that we get reports back from teachers next week. At the very same time, we should have another meeting of the Rank and File Safety Committee in which we can take reports back from the areas on the work to build these committees and mobilize the working class. But again, I just want to emphasize before we take reports from each of your areas that everything depends on the initiative of educators and workers ourselves. From the standpoint of the politicians, the media, the CDC, the unions, everything is being done in a haphazard fashion to confuse people, to divide districts by districts, state by states. But there is enormous opposition, but it has to be united and organized. So again, join the committee, join and spread the Facebook page, organize discussions with educators, teachers at your school to oppose the reopening of schools, and build next week's meeting even bigger and larger than this meeting to take forward the organization of this resistance.